Hey, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and this is my new Peddinghaus 21011 38-ton ironworker. I'm going to show you how I got it in here, which was a task, how I cleaned it up, and what it does. Check it out. All right, so this is the ironworker I picked up. And when we got it from the guy and brought it here, this is Matt's shop. You'll recognize this because this is where the other ironworker I bought is. And we took it off the base, power washed it, cleaned it up a lot, and it's been sitting here. So now we're gonna load it back into my truck so that I can get it back to my shop. And here we have a forklift, which is just great. I don't have one of those at home. So having the ability to use Matt's forklift was great. We picked this up just a couple blocks away from his shop, and just to make things easy, we dropped it off there so we could clean it up. And then once I had a little bit more time and space in my shop, we planned to bring it there. The first thing I wanted to do was weigh it because I needed to know how heavy it was so that I could move it around once I got it home. I was surprised to see that it was over 2,000 pounds. I don't know if that's going to come up, but 2,120 pounds. All right, spin it so you can make it great. So when I get back to my shop, I have to lift this out of the back of my van using an engine crane. The engine crane I have will lift 2 tons. This machine being a little over 1 ton, I want to set my machine at 1.5 tons. In order for me to be better suited when I get there, I decided to build kind of a little pallet under the machine at Matt's. I used some 4x4s and some GRK structural screws, and then a couple of 2x4s to build a little pallet skid. And what this will allow me to do is move it a little more safely inside my van, and then also move it on a pallet jack once I get it back to the shop. My shop is about 40 minutes away from Matt's, so I wanted to make sure it was properly secured inside the truck before, I drove that distance. Now, the payload capacity of my van is 3,300 pounds, so I'm still well within the limits of this vehicle. So you're gonna see my suspension sag a lot when you put this in, and I was pretty worried about transporting this kind of weight, but in my last van, I drove a bunch of heavy equipment around and I never had any problems. So we put this thing in, and Matt used the forklift to slide it up as much as he could because I wanted the weight centered over the wheel wells as best as we could get it. We could only go in so far with the forklift, so we used the bar eventually to kind of push it, and I strapped it in. Once it was all secured, it was time to drive up to my shop and start the next process. Here we've got the engine crane and my friend Lewis helping me out. Check out Lewis's channel. I'm going to put a link down below. I really appreciate him coming and helping me. I was considering doing this by myself, and it was definitely way less sketchy having him there, although it was still very sketchy. Our plan was to lift and not move the machine at all, and in order for me to even get it close enough to the back of the truck, I had to use a steel bar and just slide it. You'd be shocked how much you can move, how much weight you can move with just using a steel bar and just sort of leveraging and sliding. It's also part of the reason why we put that wood underneath it, because it slides a lot better than the steel base. We're just going to lift the machine, and I'm going to pull out from under it. And then we're going to put the machine down. That's it. We're not moving this at all.
Good God. Okay. All right. You know what?
So it's a lot more safe than trying to move it.
Okay.
I really wanted to try and move this as safely as possible. having a sort of non-dynamic lift like this, just picking straight up and pulling the vehicle out from under it, is the safest way to move something like this with an engine crane. The engine crane can lift weight, but it can't really move that kind of weight. It's pretty flimsy. You know, it's just a Harbor Freight crane. It's nothing made by NASA. So you want to keep your moves as safe as possible by keeping them as stationary and not dynamic. Lifting this thing definitely put some strain on that piston, but it was able to hold it up.
That's cool. But look, it's barely gonna come down from here.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is I'm gonna screw a board to this, and I want you to stand out here, hold that board up, and then as I pull out, you won't have to worry about these because you're gonna be controlling the whole thing from there. It's gonna be a long, like fulcrum, you know?
Yeah.
So like all the way out there, hold that.
So I can.
Exactly.
Get it
So you'll
up.
be able to lift it a little bit. Okay, so now try to lift that a little bit. All right, so you're up right now.
Yeah. All right.
Is that a lot of weight? Are you lifting a
No,
lot of weight? It's
no,
pretty
it's
mild. I know, and that it's gonna spin a little bit. As I come out, it might. It's right now. If I drive straight, nothing's gonna catch.
All right.
It's gonna pull straight out. All right, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
We had to take the pallet off so we could drop it between the legs of the engine crane.
Okay, hold on. Work forward. All right.
Get out of the way. Dude, when I saw the wheels come off,
Yeah,
and
I knew that was
went,
gonna lurch. I know, that was sketchy.
Hindsight, shouldn't have been there.
Yeah. That last little bit, that was a sketchy part. You know?
Yeah.
Whew.
So once we had it on the ground, I wanted to spin it into the position that I would be able to get a pallet jack underneath it. Now, my gravel driveway, as you can see, doesn't really make things easy when it comes to moving heavy stuff. So in order for me to even get it into the shop, I'm going to have to pull it on a pallet jack. Now, once I had it out there, I did a little bit of a kind of greaseball paint job on it. I got this leafy green paint from Rust-Oleum from my local hardware store and just basically started spraying it. Then I decided to take some gray, just paint and primer in one and paint the base to clean it up. I took the little caps and anything that had a red accent and shot it with some red paint. I really didn't do a proper paint job on this. I basically just masked stuff off. And after we had power washed it, it was mostly clean. There's obviously still a bunch of grease on there, but I just painted over it. It works fine. This is the angle iron and bar stock clamp. I had a bit of a time trying to get this thing apart, including breaking a hammer. Once I got that little bar out, I actually re-lubricated this with some oil and it slid really, really nice. Also got some of the grease off. Painting all these parts red, they were all painted red from the factory, and it would have just been to alert someone that there's a, kind of a dangerous action going on either near them or behind them. I also wanted to paint this clamp, which was originally red, so I just jammed some paper towels in there and painted behind it. Overall, looked pretty good. And the nice thing is if you get spray paint on something that's covered in grease and you don't want the paint there anymore, you just wipe the grease off and the paint goes with it. Now, one of the things I wanted to do was put this thing on wheels. Now, this is obviously a very heavy machine, weighs over 2,000 pounds, so I bought some casters that could hold 1,000 pounds each, so that's a 4,000 pound set of casters. I went ahead and cut the original posts off of this base, and I think this was just sort of a homemade base. It's just some I-beam, and these legs were just little pins. I used my mag drill from Evolution to drill holes for 3/8 hardware all along the base. And this is just a way better way to drill holes in steel like this, where, I can't obviously bring this to a drill press. So, in between a phone call over here, I used my mag drill to drill out all these holes. And it really just does make quick work of drilling into an I-beam like this. You can see too, I chose to use casters that don't have rubber on the wheels, and that was intentional because with this much weight, the rubber usually gets compressed and eventually it'll break. With just solid steel wheels, I don't have to worry about any rubber breaking. It's also a little bit less resistance when you're rolling across a steel floor. Now I got all these things through bolted, and then I had to cut some of the bolts because they were just a little bit too long. It was what I had at the time. I put 2 pivoting wheels on the front and 2 stationary wheels on the back. This should make it easier to roll. Once I had those bolted on, I could flip the base back over, do any little touch-ups that I had to do, and I could start the process of pulling this thing into the shop. Now again, the gravel driveway is super problematic, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, so I couldn't ask anybody to come and help. So I just laid out some sheets of plywood and, gave it some elbow grease and pulled this sucker across the gravel.
Yes!
So now that I had the machine inside, I wanted to add some levelers to it, and the material I'm going to use to screw through the levelers is this 1-inch plate that I had left over from another project. Now I'm going to be drilling this out and tapping it with a 3/4 inch tap, and I do this over on the Bridgeport, and I'm going to be using my Tapmatic tapping head, which you'll see makes quick work of tapping in through this 1-inch plate. I've got another little video where I make a part for a client and I show a little bit more about the tapping head, but this is a Tapmatic 90X. This will tap up to 1.25 inches, and I throw a little bit of Omeda tapping oil on it and run it right through. It's honestly the fastest way to tap material like this. My Bridgeport does have a little bit of a smaller capacity than it needs, so I have to kind of back the tap out the last bit on my own. But you can see it here in real time, tapping this 1-inch plate with a 3/4 16 tap.
Beautiful.
I cleaned these up with the angle grinder over on the bench just to bevel the edges a little bit because I'm going to be welding these to the bottom of the rolling base. Test. Okay. I had the base flipped up on its side, and I used the angle grinder to get some of the rust and whatever pitting was on the bottom of it. I'm going to be welding this 1-inch plate to the bottom of that so that I'm not relying on the weld to hold up the machine. I want there to just be sort of a stacked assembly so that the actual plate itself is holding up the base. This is a really heavy machine, and I'm asking a lot of these threads and of this plate to hold it up, even if I am just lifting it a tiny bit. I had beveled this material pretty well, and I'm welding it along the edges, and this is a 3/8 I-beam, so there's some pretty good mass for me to weld to. Once I had the plates welded to it, I flipped it back over, rolled it around, made sure that nothing had warped too badly, and then I went over and I welded up some 3/4 inch steel threaded rod that I got from McMaster to some 1-inch pieces to make a little bit of a T-handle. And this will make it just so that I don't have to get any tools or anything if I want to lift the machine and level it. Really, these are less for leveling the machine, and they're more for taking the weight off of those casters. I get worried about, kind of inexpensive casters. These were like $70 for the set, and if those bearings were to fail, the whole machine would probably topple over. So having something to keep it up off the ground and off those casters makes me feel a lot better. You can see how I can thread this threaded rod through, and then I got these leveling feet from McMaster as well, and they easily can lift the machine base with nothing on it, and they actually do lift the machine pretty well too. Now, because the base is on wheels now, I got a little bit worried about it having no crossbars on the bottom, so I figured what better opportunity to use the Ironworker to punch some holes in this 1/4 inch angle. There was a punch already in there, and I knew it would be big enough for the 3/8 hardware, so I punched 2 holes and I bolted this angle iron to the front of the machine. This will also give me an opportunity to mount the foot pedal that's going to have to go on later. And with the machine being on wheels, if this base decided to fail, it would be able to kind of roll away from itself and it could spread. And I just was worried about having all that weight with nothing holding the bottom. I didn't weld this base up, so it's hard for me to trust someone else's work. And this will just give me a little bit of an insurance policy before I go and put the 2,200 pounds on top of it. I also did the same thing on the back of the base. So there's 2 pieces of angle iron stretching the base above the wheels. Now, the moment of truth, getting the machine up on the base, I rolled it around with the pallet jack. You can see I'm kind of fighting my way through the shop. The anvil I just moved is a 400-pound Fisher on a 130-pound base. So that thing is not so forgiving if it's in your way. But it slides really nice on the concrete floor. I've got a 2-ton little hoist hanging from an I-beam above. And I moved my lathe on these beams before, so I know to trust them. And with the 2-ton hoist, I can lift this thing up and throw it on the base. Having a lifting hook is definitely helpful. Any lift like this is always a little scary to do by myself. Obviously, I trust the beam that I'm hanging from to hold this material, but you never know when something's going to fail. A chain link, the hook, the thread, and being there by myself is always a little bit nerve-wracking. The holes that were actually in the base were torch cut and they were a little bit big, so I had a little bit of room for error, but I threw a little tapered punch in that back corner, and that gave me a little bit of a kind of spotter so that as I lowered it I was close, and then I could use a bar to push it directly into place. I made sure to put all 4 bolts back in with the lock washers exactly how it was when I got it. Now with it off the hook, I can try and move it across the shop. I was honestly thinking that it was going to roll a little bit better, but the bar definitely helps. I'm really not going to be moving it too much around the shop, and if I do, I'll make sure to have help with me. But I really just want to be able to put it into its spot and push it in and out. The idea of the pivoting wheels on the front are really just so that if I need to drive it around, I can. But in reality, I just need to be able to push it into its sort of parking spot and pull it out. The punch is on the front of the machine, but the notcher and shear are on the back, along with the angle iron shear. So once I get it in place, I'm going to be kind of leveling it and using the punch mainly. And then I kind of modified the casters themselves so that they wouldn't pivot, but they would, be locked so that they don't have to turn themselves around. If you've ever tried to push a machine with pivoting casters backwards, the casters always want to flop back over, so I figured out a way to lock them in place so they don't go anywhere. Now I had to make a little mount for the foot pedal. The foot pedal actuates the lever that makes the punch action go, so you don't have to take one hand off the material. So what's nice is I'm able to use the machine now to punch through all this 1/4 inch plate and get everything set up. Making sure everything's lined up with that clamp, then I can mark everything out, and I'll actually be able to use the shear to cut this. I think I misspoke. I think I said this was 1/4 inch plate, but it's actually 3/8. And you can see how I pull the machine out when I need to get to the shear section. Now the shear has a little hold down, and check this out in real time. Shearing 3/8 plate, no problem at all. Now I do get a little bit of deformation on the cutoff, and I think that's just because of the way my blades are adjusted, so I'm going to have to work on that so I can get a little bit better of an offcut, because sometimes I need both sides of the material. But you can see how effortlessly I'm able to punch through this. I'll mark this out, take that angle iron off, and I'll punch these holes. I also punched a couple of additional holes because I thought I might be mounting something else to the front of this angle iron. And before I take it out, I lowered those little pads just because I wanted to make sure if this thing, wanted to move or spread without that crossbar, it couldn't really go anywhere. Made sure everything was bolted back together. And these are the same bolts that are holding the caster, so it works out. I don't have to, put any additional hardware down there. I'm using 3/8 hardware on pretty much the entirety of this machine just because it was what I had on hand and it's nice and strong. Before I mounted the foot pedal back on, I painted it the same green as the rest of the machine, including the arm. Just sort of cleaned everything up. Really makes a big difference from what it looked like when I got it. And you can see that little cover is there so you don't accidentally push the foot pedal. The other thing I wanted to do was re-grease the machine. We power washed it, which washed a lot of the grease off, but I also looked in the manual and I found the exact grease that the machine needs and a diagram of all the ports. So I went through and I greased every single port on the machine, and I also did the bearing grease, the motor grease, and everything else. There was a nice little roller that had been installed on the base, and I wanted to make sure to get that back in, so I painted it and put it in place. It's really great. It'll be awesome for kind of punching longer material. It's pretty heavy, and I had this kind of random spring from an old machine, so I wedged it down in the hole, and that'll actually give me a little bit of positive pressure, so I'm not always worried about that thing dropping. And now you can see how nicely it holds up material, and it's really easy to adjust. So if I have to punch angle, I can punch it either, kind of leg up, or I can flip it over and punch it the other way as well by just lowering the roller. There's also a hole for it on the other side of the machine as well. All right, so I've got the cover off. Very dangerous. Shouldn't do this. But I'm going to show you what happens. So this is a big flywheel. It's a big steel flywheel. It's running off 2 belts from the motor. A little washer here that's supposed to be pressed in. And there's actually a grease fitting right there. So I'm going to throw a little grease on this axle. Make sure that this thing is getting properly lubricated. Check this out. You should never run a machine, any machine, without the covers on. But you see how it functions.
I pull this lever, it's going to engage this clutch. So this side has that little pinion gear in the center, spins these two big gears. I just sprayed these down with some Mobile Tack 375, which is an open gear lubricant. And that's what's recommended by the manual. Well, it's an alternative to what's recommended by the manual. And on this side, we've got that huge flywheel, which spins that small gear and gives the mechanical advantage to press. 38-ton short throw press.
The other thing I wanted to do was clean up the dies that I got with the machine. This was a whole assortment. Obviously, some of these had been reworked and reground, and a lot of them had probably gotten lost over the years, but the shop that I got it from didn't really use the machine, so I have a feeling that a lot of these punches and dies are very old and have sort of just been coupled with the machine for a long time. I cleaned them up using Simple Green and a wire brush. Okay, so I spent some time going through these punches and dies. All these bottom dies I don't have punches for. And all these sets you see here are complete with proper clearances for kind of standard materials. So there is a difference between the hole in the die and the actual diameter of the punch. And depending on the thickness of the material that you're punching, you need to have different clearances. So the thicker material, you need a larger bottom die clearance from your punch diameter. So going through these, I'm generally going to be punching 1/4 inch and 3/8. So I checked, kind of cross-referenced what I had in terms of punches and dies and came up with this nice little selection. All this stuff came with the Ironworker, so this is a great starting point, and then I can order new punches to match these dies or new sets altogether if I want to just get brand new stuff. These are consumable, they do wear out, they get chips, and the whole quality suffers as these things wear out. So these I'm going to put to the side, and these I'm going to put in the Ironworker so they're ready to go, and keep moving. All right, I've got a piece of 1/4 inch. Right here, I've got a 7/16 punch in there. I'll put a little bit of lubricant on the punch itself, and we will punch a hole in this material, set the spotter down. Perfect hole, little burr on the backside, but no big deal. Easy to correct. This machine will also chop solid square bar. You put it in here, and then you hold it up against this stop, and this kind of acts as the clamp. We can chop a piece of this too. All right, that about does it for this video. I'm so excited to have this thing in the shop. It's going to make a huge difference in the amount of time I spend on the simple fabricating projects that involve cutting holes especially and shearing plate. When I do the welding classes, I have to cut up little coupons for people to learn with, and something like this is going to save me a ton of time in just batch cutting the 1/8 inch plate that we use. And I make a lot of brackets and stuff that use bolts, so I ordered some special dies that will be the perfect size for 1/4 inch hardware, 3/8 inch hardware, and I usually use 3/16 holes for when I do brackets that get screwed into the wall with structural screws or decking screws and stuff like that. So totally going to change the amount of time it takes me to fabricate things, and I'm really excited to kind of expand on its capabilities and have in my mind the different types of tooling that I can buy that will help me just make my projects that much better. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see what I'm doing behind the scenes here in the shop, you can follow me here at Make Everything Shop on Instagram. I post every day. I posted a lot about the day that I picked this up and how we cleaned it up over at Matt's shop. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this and more videos of me using the Ironworker. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments and I'd be happy to answer them. If you want to see anything specific or you want me to do a dedicated video kind of showing the processes that I use this machine for, I would be happy to do that. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'm Chris Zepp from Make Everything, and I will see you on the next video.